Well, hello and welcome. Let's talk about Keitora et al. 2020, Chapter 2, The Dynamic Environment of International Trade. In this chapter, we're learning about the re-establishment of world trade post-World War II. We're learning about balance of payment figures for a country's GDP. We're learning about the effects of protectionism on world trade and several types of trade barriers. We're learning about the provisions of the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act. We're learning about the GATT and World Trade Organization. And we're also learning about the emergence of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank Group. So let's get going. So trade barriers can be an international marketer's minefield. When we have to deal with tariffs and non-tariff barriers, it gets kind of complicated. And the textbook talks about how until recently, tariffs and non-tariff barriers, the amount that they've been used has been reduced. But that's not the case. In the past 3 years, they have been increased under the Trump administration. So even though this book is published in 2020, it would have been written in 2017, probably. So there's some aspects in every textbook that's not accurate, and in this textbook, that's one of them. So the election of nationalistic leaders, of course, threaten the reduced use of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, as has happened with the Trump administration. Some countries attempt to control trade for their own advantage, as is happening with the USA at the moment. And as competition increases, so does the tendency towards protectionism. And that may well be one of the reasons why the US is enacting protectionist strategies currently. Now, global trade benefits all. It provides more business opportunities and it provides a wider selection of goods and services for consumers. Here's the top 10 trading partners as of 2017. There you go, 2017. I suggested the book had been written in 2017. I hold my ground on that point. Anyway, China's at the top of the list in terms of US trading partners. Next is Canada, and then next is Mexico. So geographically, we've got Canada to the north and Mexico to the south, and then comes Japan, Germany, and South Korea. France is at 8. Now, trade balance statistics are usually greatly, or can be, distorted. Imports from China include parts from other countries as well. So we'll often see this taking place in electronic imports. And in 2017, for example, Apple importing from China approximately 16 billion in iPhones and 8 billion in iPads. So there's sources of distortion. Sorry, I just want to go back to that previous slide. 2017, this is what Apple imports from China. Approximately $16 billion in iPhones and approximately 8 billion in iPads. So that means that Apple is manufacturing in China and bringing that into the US. Okay. Just wanted to check that point. All right, sources of distortion in prominent trade statistics, right? So the value of the iPhone that's shipped from China to the US, right, that includes components and labor, is made up of this constitution. The value of the iPad that's shipped from China is made up of this in terms of costs and profits. Apple gets 30%. Chinese labor accounts for just 2%. Cheap labor, that's why they're outsourcing to China. And this visual graphic is showing you an example of US manufactured John Deere tractors as opposed to or juxtaposed to Hyundai cars being shipped from South Korea. So the John Deere tractors are going out, the Hyundai cars are coming in, and the graphic is suggested to represent the negative trade balance that the US is currently carrying. From the 20th to the 21st century, World War I ended up in an economic depression and trade was halted due to high tariff walls. The United States set to spread capitalism after World War II, and new markets were created as a result. The GATT agreement, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, was passed to prevent a similar situation to what happened post-World War I. So the GATT came into effect post-World War II and effectively was put in place in order to reduce tariffs and trade barriers so that we didn't go into economic depression again. US multinationals branched out to foreign economies and many economic opportunities came to bear after World War II, after GATT was enacted, and US dominance was deemed as threatening by late 1960s. Thing is that Europe and Latin America put limits on US investments, so they blocked. The result was that economic power was evenly more distributed. In terms of the balance of merchandise trade, the role of the US in global trade evolved through time, was favourable until 1979, when a constant trade deficit was then the norm. Many important questions were raised in the 1980s. How do American firms compete in foreign markets? And what is the fairness of international trade policies? Shifting into the 90s, there was many changes in the world trade market, creation of organisations to facilitate trade, such as NAFTA, which is now MCA. The EU bloc was formed as the Asia Pacific, the APEC form, and AFTA. So power expected to shift to more countries, new market opportunities, countries with power investing in other countries. We saw that happen, and companies expanding globally. So in terms of international trade, financial transactions occurred within each trade, money constantly flowing in and out of the country, and it was important to keep track of these transactions. So we do that through this balance of payments statement. We're recording all financial transactions with other countries. Credits and debits must offset, and we use a double entry bookkeeping system. We use three main accounts: the current account, and that's what is of interest to international business, the capital account, and the reserves account. The high merchandise trade deficit yields an imbalance, so value of US currency low, less purchasing power, less demand for imports, and US products cheap for foreign buyers, so we end up with higher exports. Here's a graph telling us about the current state of the current account balance in terms of a percentage of GDP. So you can see in 28 is round about where we had an issue, and in 2017 it was at negative 2%, and now we are at more like negative 3%. So in terms of the reality of world trade, countries do protect their own markets, and they do this to ward off unwanted foreign investments and imports. They'll deliberately use barriers for protections, barriers that include tariffs, so taxes on goods coming into a country, for example, quotas, capping what international traders can do, exchange barriers, psychological barriers, And there are arguments for and against protectionism. Protectionism is part of what you see the Trump administration doing currently. They are protecting the home agricultural market, as in the domestic American agricultural market. They're trying to keep the money in the US rather than American companies outsourcing to China or even to Mexico. The protectionism argument is about encouraging capital accumulation and maintaining a standard of living. But there's also arguments that include conservation of resources, industrialization of low wage, maintenance of employment, so keep the jobs at home, reduction of unemployment, national defense purposes, enhancement of business size, and retaliation. The thing is that protectionism can be harmful. It contributes to industrial inefficiency for the nation. It detracts from the nation's adjustment to the world situation. So it detracts from the free market mechanism. And what ends up happening, as we've seen with the China tariffs that were signed into law this week, they cost the American consumers money, less likely to purchase, which in turn hurts the economy. And free trade is typically beneficial. More people are willing to purchase, higher purchasing power for the average consumer, increased income of all involved, and more job opportunities. So effectively, we end up, or at least up until 2016, a growth of consumer purchasing power. And according to economists in the current market, US market, it's the consumer that's driving the strength in the economy. So governments establish tariffs and non-tariffs because they want to put up a barrier for foreign imports and businesses. And these include quotas, boycotts, monetary barriers, and market barriers. There's reasons for these barriers. They want to develop new domestic industries, and they want to protect current domestic industries. So tariffs tend to increase inflation and special interest privileges. They increase government control and political considerations, political influence, and they also increase the number of tariffs resulting from companies being impacted by those tariffs. So, you can expect some retaliation going on. The tariff barriers tend to weaken in terms of balance of power positions, supply and demand patterns, and international trade war relations. Tariff barriers tend to restrict manufacturing supply sources, choices available to consumers, and competition. There's a variety of non-tariff barriers, as we've mentioned: quotas and import licenses, voluntary export restraints, boycotts and embargoes, monetary barriers, standards, product standards, for example, anti-dumping penalties, and domestic subsidies and economic stimuli. So voluntary export restraint is evidenced here, where we've got a Japanese freight ship bringing automobiles from Japan to Jordan via the Red Sea, but they don't take it to neighbouring Israel because of an Arab boycott of Israel. And so, ironically, automobiles are imported into Israel on a separate shipment. So, what's this Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act? It's a US policy established in 1988. It helps US businesses more successfully navigate world markets. It helps correct perceived injustices in trade policies. Many countries are allowed to trade freely with the US, but that's not the same. Countries do not reciprocate access, unfortunately. So this act covers 3 areas for improving US trade: market access, export expansion, and import relief. Now, the GATT agreement came into play after World War II, and that has three main provisions. Trade will be conducted on a non-discriminatory basis. Protection shall be afforded domestic industries through custom tariffs, not through commercial measures such as import quotas, and consultation shall be a primary method used to solve global trade issues. The GATT agreement went through 8 rounds of negotiation or renegotiation since inception. There was the Tokyo round in 1974. They agreed on some tariff cuts, but there's still many issues. And the Uruguay round 1994, which was sector specific. And from that Uruguay round, we have the creation of the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization is designed to ease trade restrictions across 164 members participating and adhering to the rules, supposedly. We have a panel of experts to hear and resolve issues, and the rules of GATT are mostly accepted, but there are some countries who find loopholes. There are 2 global institutions that help nations become and remain economically viable. These 2 global institutions are the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The International Monetary Fund is a membership of 188 companies, and their purpose is to stabilize foreign exchange rates and establish freely convertible currency. So they developed special drawing rights. The World Bank has different goals. The World Bank has the purpose of reducing poverty and improving living standards, as well as promoting sustainability and investment in people. This World Bank group is made up of 5 institutions with separate objectives, but they come together to achieve these 2 main objectives. The World Bank provides loans and technical assistance and policy guidance to help developing nations achieve their set goals. Now, there are protests against globalization and against global institutions. We have the anti-capitalist protesting that emerged in 1999 or beginning 1999. They're fighting against the unintended consequences of globalization, such as environmental harm, worker exploitation and job loss, cultural extinction, higher oil prices, and diminished sovereignty. There are some protests that are violent, including terrorist attacks. There's also some non-violent protests that have enacted policy change. Here, for example, we've got a silent protest by Gifford Myers in Italy with his object of globalization. And here's an example of a demonstration of hate in America. Sorry, didn't happen in America. Oh, it did happen in America. Stop Anti-World Trade Organization rioting in Seattle. And they smashed Starbucks window as an icon of Americanization. Anyway, these last 2 slides give you long descriptions of the terms that are used in the chapter, and you're welcome to check that out. I'll look forward to talking about chapter 3.